Some 4,000 years ago, according to legend, a demigod called Tangun founded this country. He led the primitive tribes of Manchuria into the formation of a country which Tangun named the Land of Morning Calm. 4,000 years have brought many changes to this mountainous land, but none stranger or more fearsome than the events which have occurred in the past 2 years in this country which we now call Korea. Here, today, a courageous Canadian brigade are fighting with the same spirit and elan with which their fathers and brothers have fought, twice already during this century in 2 great world wars. In company with the fighting representatives of 16 other nations, they are striving to keep the flag of freedom flying in this outpost where liberty and independence have been so flagrantly threatened. The story of Canada's 25th Brigade goes back to August of 1950, when the brigade, then known as the Special Force, was first formed to fulfill Canadian commitments to halt communist aggression in Korea, under the banner and direction of the United Nations. Shortly after the brigade was mobilized, it moved to Fort Lewis in Washington State to complete its training under command of Brigadier John Rockingham.
Yeah, Fort Lewis. Sure seems a long time ago since we moved down there. I always heard a lot of talk about that West Coast, but about all I can remember now is the way it could rain out there. Nice country and all that, but brother, it was wet. And the training. Well, we had some fine instructors, men who had been in the last war, and they knew all the wrinkles. The sort of stuff that would stand by us later on when we got where we were going. They sure put us through the hoops. But we were all glad of the sort of training we had later on when we got to Korea. We didn't get very much of the parade square, but concentrated on tactical training, as the lieutenant called it. We marched for miles over that camp area. There was plenty of room down there to move around. Then we would fire our weapons out in the ranges. Then back to pounding our dogs again in all sorts of weather, most of it bad. Between all that and lectures from the major, he had all the answers when we started on maneuvers. We sure got the works. And the old man, that's Rocky, you know. He was our brigade commander right from the start. He was always around, asking questions and dreaming up more exercises for us to go through. We got plenty of practice on those exercises, believe me. And all the other boys in the support companies had time to learn a lot about their equipment. Stuff like flamethrowers. Those babies could sure make it hot for anything that ever got in their way. It was good to know that all our equipment was the best, and at the end of it, we were not very worried on that score. And we were in good shape, ready for anything.
The main principles of infantry training were well covered during the brigade's stay at Fort Lewis. Exercises involving all formations in the brigade group were planned and carefully worked out, with emphasis placed on a thorough knowledge of what infantry support can accomplish and the speedy methods available through good communications for calling on this support when required. And so for 5 months, the brigade continued its training, each day becoming more battle-worthy. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry had sailed early in November for Korea, where they completed their training alone. This move had been decided upon by the United Nations Command, due to the tactical situation in Korea at that time. The Patricias went into action early and subsequently covered themselves with glory, winning the United States Distinguished Unit Citation at Kapyong. The remainder of the brigade at Fort Lewis wound up its training, and prior to leaving for overseas, they were honored by a visit from His Excellency Viscount Alexander, then Governor General of Canada. Accompanied by Defense Minister Brooke Claxton and other dignitaries, Viscount Alexander took the salute from a march past of the brigade group. In a short address, Viscount Alexander praised the troops for their fine showing on parade and expressed his best wishes for their future success. As a parting gift, he presented Brigadier Rockingham with a Canadian flag, which has flown at the brigade headquarters ever since. A fleet of buses transported the troops from their quarters at Fort Lewis to nearby Seattle, and hasty notes were written by the soldiers to their folks at home, and all the last farewells were uttered. Embarkation from the port of Seattle took place in mid-April of 1951, and in orderly manner the troops marched aboard the waiting troop ships under the watchful eye of the brigade commander. To the martial music of military bands, the ships got underway, and the troops settled down for the 5,000-mile voyage, which was completed without event in some 18 days.
It sure was quite a trip. I never saw so much water in all my life. It was a bit crowded on board, but we had pretty smooth sailing most of the way, and we managed to have some fun. For a while, we thought the skipper had lost his way. But one day we woke up, and there she was, Korea, a whole jumble of rocky-looking hills sticking right up out of the sea. And pretty soon, we were sailing past a couple of hills right into Pusan Harbor. We docked there and were whisked off the ship in no time, right through the streets of Pusan. And before we knew it, we were back at the training again. I thought we were all through with that stuff when we left Fort Lewis, but the Major had other ideas. We had to get rid of our sea legs, he says, and get hardened up again. So pretty soon we were back at it. Only this time they threw some hills in. And boy, I'm telling you that when they say hills in Korea, they're not kidding. All of them were steep and mostly 10 miles up and 3 going down. And when you got to the top of them, all you could see were more hills. But we got used to the climbing, and it didn't take us very long to get in shape again. And the first thing we knew, we were on our way. Over a lot of potholed, dusty roads we went, north from Pusan, through places with strange names like Taegu and Daejeon, until we arrived at Seoul, the capital of Korea. It had been badly battered up with shells and bombs, and from there, we started on the job which we'd been sent to do.
The brigade went into action just east of Seoul, taking part in a major offensive which had been launched a short time before by the 8th Army. The Communists were elusive and hard to find during those first days of action. They were in full retreat to the north, and the Canadians were given the task of chasing after them and clearing them out of the hills on their particular sector of the front. The fighting was relatively light, but the going was heavy. Soldiers who had fought in Italy and northwest Europe during the last war had seldom encountered terrain which called for so much physical endurance prolonged over such extended periods. In company with other United Nations forces, the Canadians pushed rapidly ahead, advancing some 40 miles in the first 8 days. In their swift push, the Canadians had crossed the imaginary line at the 38th parallel, which has caused so much bitter controversy, and there were visited by a group of United Nations officials. Penetrating well north of this point, the Canadians continued their advance, meeting some stiff opposition on the way, and were finally ordered to halt and consolidate their positions on the outskirts of the battered town of Chorwan. During these first weeks in the line, the weather was blazing hot most of the time, and the swift movement of the leading troops placed a severe strain on the resources of the brigade's supply unit. But in true Service Corps style, the supplies of rations, ammunition, and other requirements were brought forward to the frontline troops without fail, although this entailed long hours of driving jolting trucks over the dusty tracks, which were the only roads available in many cases. Torrential rains, which periodically drenched the area, caused added concern, often bogging down vehicles in deep mud. The engineers toiled long hours to keep the roads passable. New roads were bulldozed around the sides of mountains and through the paddy fields. And when the bulldozer could not get through, the sappers blasted their way. Our troops soon found out there was nothing easy about work in this country, but no obstacle was too tough for them to overcome. Roads are of prime importance to a modern army, and it is a tribute to our sappers that in spite of all the difficulties, they built many miles of new roads, and the transport always got through. During the summer months, most communiques from 8th Army headquarters dealing with the Canadians were generally worded as follows. There was active patrolling on the West Central Front during the day. Battalion-size formations, accompanied by armor and artillery, probed some 10 miles ahead of our forward positions and attacked enemy-held ground. They received support from Navy and Army Air Force planes, which bombed and strafed the enemy lines. An estimated 20 enemy were killed and an unknown number wounded. Our casualties were light.
It would come around to our turn for a patrol about once a week. The rest of the time, the other units would be out there. We used to take off early in the morning, and we would go right out across the paddy fields and up into the hills where the Chinese were waiting. Talk about being away off in the blue, well, that's where we were. Then climbing hills again, with the old rice burners, as we called our Korean helpers, bringing up the water and rations. The artillery would back us up, with plenty of the old shells dropping in ahead of us. Our planes would burn the place up with fire bombs, and we would walk in and shoot the joint up. Then back down again in the afternoon and back up to our home in the hills, feeling kind of tired.
About this time, the Canadians had their first sight of Korean refugees. Families and often whole villages were on the move, fleeing southward from the encroaching tide of battle. In every country where the wrath of war is felt, the civilian population always suffers the most, and Korea was no different. Perhaps worse, since those poor people had little enough to begin with. Once the shells and bombs started to wreck their homes, there was nothing left for them but to retreat down the long roads, away from the frugal farms which had sheltered and fed them for generations.
They sure were a sad-looking lot. Little lads, no bigger than my kid brother Jimmy back home, walking down the road with a great big pack on his back, and often another baby at his side. I sure hope nothing like this ever happens at home. A lot of the guys sometimes wonder what we're doing out here. Well, just so long as nothing like this ever happens at home would be one good reason. But there are a lot of other things that make me feel pretty good to be out here. Like the men in my own platoon. They're a pretty good gang, and it makes me feel all right to be with them. Then we met up with a lot of other good guys from other countries. Among them were Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Englishmen, and Scots. And along in July, we joined up with them in the new division.
The 1st Commonwealth Division was formed on the 28th of July, 1951, and a brief ceremony was held at the divisional headquarters to mark the occasion. Under command of Major General James Cassels, the formations from the Commonwealth nations were formed into one group. Lieutenant General Robertson, senior Commonwealth officer in the Far East, and General Van Fleet, commander of the 8th Army, were present for the occasion, and the divisional flag was unfurled alongside the United Nations flag, under which 16 nations were fighting at that time. Shortly after this, the first rains of the annual rainy season poured down on the area, flooding rivers and washing out many of the river crossings built by our engineers. The Canadians had moved south and west from the Chowan area and had been concentrated in the vicinity of the Imjin River, which flows into the Yellow Sea on the west side of Korea. In spite of the added problems caused by the monsoon season, our troops continued to probe into enemy lines and were actively engaged in patrolling to the west and northwards across the Imjin River. Here they encountered ever-increasing resistance, and a full-scale divisional attack was planned to gain a new line well across the Imjin. Constant patrolling in this area had gained the initiative for our troops and also a sound knowledge of the nature of the terrain. Firm bases were secured and battle plans soon finalized. The plan was for our troops to take out a high feature on the right flank and then to advance on the Chinese-held positions directly ahead. This attack, if successful, would secure our positions north and west of the Imjin River. From the divisional commander right down to platoon level, everyone was carefully briefed in their task, as the enemy were known to hold the hills ahead in strength. Every rifleman in the infantry battalions looked to his weapons and readied himself for the fight ahead. Against a cunning and resourceful enemy, the Canadians, now a veteran and tested outfit, were confident of the outcome. The battalion commanders checked their units and made careful preparations for the attack. The battle started with British troops taking out the dominating feature to the right of the Canadian position. And right on schedule, the Canadians attacked. Tanks from Charlie's squadron of the Lord Strathcona's Horse went forward with the infantry. Their support and cooperation were one of the features of the magnificent showing made by the Canadian Brigade. In spite of the stubborn resistance of the enemy, aided as he was by the nature of the ground, the Canadian advance was notably successful. In this and subsequent actions, the Canadians gained an enviable reputation among all formations of the United Nations force for their fine performance. Many historians and others have pondered over the qualities which make such fine soldiers, but perhaps as close an answer as any can be supplied by one of the brigade's own padres, who has this to say on the subject.
I should find it strange if a soldier should always have a clear and comprehensive grasp of the issues of a world war, when historians are so often confused. But I sincerely believe the qualities which make a good soldier have a spiritual foundation. They are founded on the rock of a man's unflinching confidence. Confidence in his leaders, confidence in his unit and his comrades, confidence in his cause, confidence in himself, and finally, confidence in the triumph of right over wrong, which in the final analysis means confidence in God. Now, as members of this brigade, and under the direction of the United Nations organization, we have every reason to be confident of our leaders. And certainly, no soldier ever possessed a surer ground for implicit faith in his cause, which is the cause of human freedom above all national self-seeking. But underlying all, a good soldier will base his ultimate confidence in God.
The divisional attack was an outstanding success, and with all their objectives gained, the Canadians awaited their next task, once more dug in on another row of hills. All possible was done to care for the welfare of the men in this strange land which afforded none of the amenities to which they were accustomed at home. An outstanding success was the hockey rink, which, with the advent of winter, was built on the frozen Imjin River. Back on skates again, the Canadians were in their element, and hockey games were arranged for the various units in the brigade. One of the more amusing afternoons was provided by teams representing the Australian and New Zealand troops, who donned the skates and played with right goodwill for the edification of a large crowd of their comrades. While not up to the standards of Maple Leaf Gardens, the boys from down under put on a good show and were quick to pick up some of the more rugged aspects of the game. Their efforts were certainly entertaining. Hamburgers and hot coffee were provided by the brigade. The service, while rough and ready, was good and was duly appreciated by the men in this bitter weather. With the first warm breezes of spring stirring over the hills and paddy fields, the soldiers of the brigade who had now served for a year in Korea were relieved by fresh arrivals from Canada and prepared to return home. The arriving troops were greeted by Brigadier Rockingham, who told them of the fine record achieved by the Canadians in Korea. Brigadier Rockingham was justly proud of his men who had never once failed to gain an objective in attack and to hold their positions against all enemy attacks. The brigadier was confident that this record would be worthily upheld. In due course, the new formations under the leadership of Brigadier Pat Bogert took over their positions in the front line. Men of the 2nd Field Regiment, Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, the Lord Strathcona Horse, the 2nd Battalions of the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the Royal 22nd Regiment, and all the other units who had done so well to further the cause of Canadian arms and the cause of freedom-loving people everywhere, left the battlefield and prepared for the joy of returning home to their loved ones. To the sure knowledge of a job well done and the happiness of home, they will gather added satisfaction knowing that their task will be carried on to a successful conclusion by the capable men who replaced them on the Korean Hill.